Hi, Acheke. Today we're going to be looking at a period of Myanmar history from about 1640 to about the year 1700 in a presentation that I've titled Shattered Family, Myanmar, European Peoples, and the Beaver Wars. If you look at most of our history books, there's only a couple written about Miami people, the history usually begins with a series of French names. Names of Frenchmen like Grossier, Perrault, LaSalle, Penet, French explorers, coureurs des bois, were called runners of the woods, and French Jesuit priests. Very few documents or objects produced by our ancestors from this period of time survive to today, so much of the record is dominated by these French voices. This is one of those few documents here. It's a symbolic representation of the creation of a peace alliance among people who had been at war for 60 years, what's called the Great Peace of Montreal. From a European perspective, it's the signatory page of a treaty. It's the place where leaders representing political communities affix their names as a sign of those communities' obligations under the terms of that treaty. But from another point of view, the drawings represent a family in the process of figuring out how to heal from a disastrous period of their history. In this presentation, we're going to take a closer look at this tumultuous period that followed European contact with North America. And throughout, we're going to be asking some pretty difficult questions regarding the use of European primary sources produced during this period. In many cases, we're not going to find answers to those questions, but what I'm going to try to point out is how important it is that we ask these questions, because the European sources are severely limited in what they can tell us about the past. So just to review our historical eras, here's the 5 historical eras that we're going to be looking at in this course. And for the last few historical presentations, we've been focusing on the era from emergence to 1640, looking at our history before the arrival of Europeans. In this presentation, we'll begin to take a look at the second era of our history, which, as you see here, runs from about 1640 to 1780. In this presentation, we'll be looking at the first half of the early years of contact with Europeans, focusing on the years 1640 to about 1701. These early years of this second era are the most highly disrupted. In the weeks to come, we'll talk about the years from 1700 to 1780 and a degree of normalcy that returned. But today we're going to be focused on this first half and the heightened levels of disruption that occur in the earliest years of contact with Europeans. This period begins with our people, the large and small villages centered in the Wabash River Valley, here in our heartlands, which we've talked about a lot, following the Wapashikisipiwe from where is today Fort Wayne, Indiana, down to near where Purdue University is today in West Lafayette, Indiana. And remember that we've talked about pre-contact population, somewhere most people believe between 10,000 and 30,000 individuals, though it's really hard to estimate a pre-contact population. I tend to split the difference and say it's around 12 to 15,000 people. And we'll talk about it in a minute, the massive waves of disease that swept through in the late 15 and early 1600s that caused this population to collapse. But overall, it's just important as we start out to remember that this is an era defined by disruption, massive disruption really, caused by waves of disease and warfare, which drastically altered Myanmar village communities. Really, the levels of loss in this period are unfathomable. We can't really understand or grasp the levels of loss that our communities suffered at this point in our past. But somehow our ancestors found a way to survive and to return their communities to stability. We're here today in part because of those efforts. But to do so, to return to stability, to survive, required kind of like another emergence, another rebirth. And it involved rekindling ages-old alliances in that family, Ewe Mangweke, that we talked about last time, rekindling those fires of alliance, really leaning on each other as family. But it also required building new relationships and creating a new family, in part out of people that were strangers, Pekecheke, before this period, bringing them into a family, bringing them into Ewe Mangweke, and transforming people who are enemies, Ketakiamononake, and bringing them as well into this alliance of families. So transforming people from Pekecheke and Ketakiamononake into Ewe Mangweke. And by no means was that an easy process, but it seems to have been necessary for survival and the return of stability. This period of our history begins roughly in the year 1640, and the reason for this date is 1640 marks the beginning of what historians have called the Beaver Wars, or the Fur Trade Wars for our people, and this is a tipping point. There had been large levels of disruption that preceded this by at least 100 years caused by disease, but in 1640 the disruptions reached such a level that we're actually forced to flee the Wabash River Valley. Or most Mia Mia people flee the Wabash River Valley. And so 1640 really marks a dramatic turning point in our history. It's for that reason that this era is kind of defined both by the beginning of the war and the ending of the war in around 1700. This is really a breaking point for a lot of communities, what one historian calls a shattering, like a hammer hitting a pane of glass. And we didn't lose our sense of who we were, but we certainly were highly disrupted and significantly dislocated from our traditional homelands. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. I want to begin this section, though, by recounting a story that clearly begins this from our perspective. So rather than beginning the story with Perrault's visit or Grossier's visit, beginning with these French perspectives, we're going to begin with a Mia Mia perspective on our first contact with the French. So instead of a French first contact story, it's a Mia Mia first contact story. And that's a really important inversion of the usual narrative. We want to frame things from our point of view, because there's plenty of material out there that frame things from the French or European point of view. So we need to, within our own community, balance that or check that a little bit. This story was recounted to Charles Trowbridge in 1824 by either Pinjiwa, Jean-Baptiste Richardville, or Me Chikaleta, who's also known as Le Gros. And the story most likely occurred on Lake Huron, probably just north of what is today Detroit. If you look here on the map, you can see the neutral Huron and the Huron peoples who call themselves today the Wyandots, our elder brothers, who lived to our north. And so the story is going to be centered somewhere in their country here, just to the north of the straits here where Detroit is located. So here's what Trowbridge reported from Mia Mia people he interviewed in the winter of 1824-1825. The earliest incident in their history which they recollect is the arrival of the French in the lakes. The Wyandots, who then lived upon Lake Huron, sent word to the Miamis and Potawatomis that a strange people had arrived there, whom they feared because they were white and had long beards, and that they desired the assistance of their brethren to destroy them. When the Miamis and Potawatomis arrived, they found 4 vessels loaded with French. The 3 nations ambuscaded, and when the visitors had disembarked, they attacked and destroyed them. A few remained in one of the vessels, who hoisted sail and made their escape. Then the Wyandots told their allies, "You see, brothers, that these people, though they look like them, cannot be Manitous. They are unlike us, and their design in coming here must certainly be evil. We have placed the tomahawk in your hands, and you are now prepared to defend yourself against them. In the meantime, if any more should arrive, we shall probably want your assistance in repelling them." So we can't be 100% sure when this story happened in time. We have a pretty good sense of where it occurred. We do know that the French record preserves no story that parallels this, just as our record preserves no story of Perrault's visit. Their record preserves no story of this attack on 4 French vessels. It's possible that that the story recalls the attack correctly and its location correctly, but maybe not as many Frenchmen died as the story claims, and maybe the vessels were just scared off, and that's why it doesn't show up in the French record. I think it's fair to say that if 3 large ships of Frenchmen were attacked and killed, that probably would have made it into the record. So stories can shift some of their factual elements over time, but still keep kind of core ideas in place. And the idea that these people were viewed as strange, as strangers, and that the Wyandots felt they were potentially dangerous, led to an attack on them. So again, this wary status, where being a stranger was potentially dangerous. In this case, they ended up becoming enemies, at least for a time. But even if this story occurred prior to 1640, which it likely did, this was still occurring within a highly disrupted period of time. So prior to 1640, disease had been already working its damaging effects on all indigenous people in North and South America. When the Spanish first arrived in the Bahamas and eventually in what became Mexico and Peru, they brought disease with them, really, really highly contagious diseases like smallpox, what our ancestors called Meme-Kilukinge. And smallpox is a really high mortality rate for people who have no immunities to it. Most historians who study the development of disease believe that because Europeans lived in close contact with large animals, that this exposed them to a lot more diseases, which over time the Europeans then developed immunities to. And because indigenous people in North America did not have large domesticated animals, and they didn't live in close contact with animals and their waste, they did not have a similar kind of resistance. And so diseases like smallpox were really very dangerous to communities. What they call virgin soil epidemics could kill anywhere from 30 to 90% of a village community. So communities could be entirely wiped out by these epidemics. Smallpox, Meme-Kilukinge, swept through North America twice between 1519 and 1524, and then came through again in 1639. Origins for all these outbreaks were probably the islands in the Caribbean, as well as what became Mexico. And sadly, again, really tragically for a lot of these communities, the people most likely to survive are small children and the elderly. But when you survive a smallpox outbreak, you're in an incredibly weakened condition. So you survived, but you're usually on the edge of death in terms of dehydration, malnutrition, and because of the massive sores that then break and bleed, you're also in need of medical care in terms of bandaging and stopping these wounds so that you don't lose too much blood. But the two groups most likely to survive, the elderly and the young, need the help of adults then afterwards to drink water, take food, be bandaged. And adults were the most likely to be killed by these diseases. So it's one of the reasons why survival rates were so horrific. And again, we can't imagine what it was like when these diseases swept through communities prior to the development of any kind of immunity. Later outbreaks of smallpox that occur in the 1700s and 1800s are bad, but a lot of these indigenous communities have developed some level of immunity so that not as many people die. Measles, Meme-Kilukinge, also swept through and measles has a lower mortality rate, but it's still, when you have no immunity, can kill quite a few people. And those who survive oftentimes are left not functioning. They're oftentimes blinded. So the damage that it can do to a community, again, is pretty high. And this swept through, there's one documented epidemic sweeping through in the 1630s. And there's perhaps more epidemics that aren't recorded in the European historical record or the archaeological record that we don't know about. I think that's a safe bet. So these diseases, as I said, they produce massive loss within lots of communities. And in some cases, disease is actually one of the forces that pushes warfare to heightened levels in North America. And disease is one of the forces leading to what is called the Beaver Wars, the fur trade wars that occur in the Great Lakes between the 1640s and 1700. And the Beaver Wars are really set up by pressures in the east coming from the Haudenosaunee, the 5 and eventually 6 nations of the League of the Iroquois, who have set up some of the earliest trading relationships with Europeans and acquired guns and metal tools and metal weapons. But just like our communities, they were horribly impacted by disease, and so inside their communities there was a lot of loss. And they were also involved in early warfare among peoples on the eastern coast as they competed both for the furs that they would trade for trade goods from Europeans, as well as they would compete for access to European trading posts to kind of control the access points to Europeans. And all of this led to, as I said, a decrease in their populations and triggered, I think it's fair to say, triggered a cultural norm that existed, but amplified this cultural norm. And this cultural norm is what people oftentimes call the Morning War cycle. And the Morning War is something we talked a little bit about last week, that when someone dies within your community and within your family, you need to, in a way, fill that hole, close that gap, by either sort of taking revenge on an enemy who may have been the one who caused the death, and then that kind of fills the hole. The revenge kind of fills the gap in the family. Or if it was a young person who died from disease, the goal would be to go to another community and bring back a captive to adopt in that person's place, sometimes even taking their name and wearing their clothes. And sometimes if their age or gender wasn't exactly right, of course that wouldn't happen. But the idea is that gap in the family had to be closed, either by killing someone else in retribution if it was a loss from war, or adopting in someone to take that person's role within the community. And this was in part functional, that families would do this to keep their family going in terms of helping with the work and labor of the family, caring for people. But it was also psychological, helping people. This is the means by which people healed from loss, the psychological losses. And also, in some cases, metaphysical, in that there was a belief among a lot of communities, including Miami communities, that if you didn't do this, that sickness would begin to spread within the family. And that perhaps that the spirit of the person who was gone would come back, drawn by the grief of the family, and would spread sickness within the family, and more people would die. And so the hole had to be filled for all these reasons. The functional reason that care of people in the family, especially if there are older members of the family, dealing with the grief of loss, and then dealing with the potential of that the spirit of the deceased might return if you don't fill that hole and cause more sickness and death within the family. This cultural belief became amplified when you had many more hundreds of deaths than a community normally experienced. And so you had many more families who needed either to kill in retribution or kidnap to fill a hole in their family. And this forced groups like the Iroquois to go farther and farther outside their boundaries to seek a way to bring the mourning within these families to a close. Now they're also going farther and farther from their traditional homelands to seek more furs so that they can trade more with Europeans. as populations of fur-bearing animals begin to dwindle around their traditional homelands. This is the reason why a lot of times people call it the fur trade wars, the beaver wars, that they're coming west to the Great Lakes to seek more beaver, which are the preferred fur of Europeans at this point for trade, but also deer and other fur-bearing animals or hide-bearing animals were traded. And so the Iroquois sweep into the lower Great Lakes. You can see here on this map kind of a rough demonstration of their path into the lower Great Lakes. And there's been a lot of focus on in the distant past of history of sort of that guns were the primary advantage that the Haudenosaunee people had. But that's kind of been oversold. Guns in this period of time were not very practical for warfare. They had a high fear factor at first because of the loud noise and the damage that they could do if used properly. But reloading took so much time at this point. They were heavy and cumbersome. These aren't the lighter weight muskets that would come about in the later 1700s. And so really it was the steel weapons that were a huge advantage on the part of the Haudenosaunee. And that they were, of course, coming on the heels of multiple other disruptions, so hitting people that were already very, very weakened. In response, most Miamia people flee the Wabash River Valley. There's some instances in the record that we can tell some small communities kind of hid out in what would become Indiana and Illinois, but for the most part, it seems most Miami people fled the Wabash River Valley and then ended up all the way in Wisconsin, just to the south of Green Bay, about 350 miles from Fort Wayne. And there are, of course, multiple issues with this move. There's just the fact of being a relocated refugee community. So it's not your traditional village site, it's not our traditional lands when we're living there. It's a big community, perhaps as many as 20,000 people all living together in a series of villages that are tightly packed together. So population concentrations that are not normal. The growing season was shorter up in Wisconsin, about 10 degrees colder in the wintertime. And so, the size of a crop of corn you could grow was much, much lower. And the diseases that we talked about would spread a lot easier in tightly packed villages, as well as other diseases that had always existed in North America that could come from human waste being, too much human waste being around villages or in the water supply. So it's here near Green Bay, on the Fox River, that the first sustained contact with the French in the French record begins. First with a French explorer named Grossier, who comes through and briefly connects with Miamia communities. There's a lot of questions around the accuracy of his source. He makes some mistakes or potentially lies in particular places, not around the Miamia contact, but anytime a source is untruthful, it sort of raises question marks about the whole source. But his interactions aren't very deep anyway with Miami people. The most sustained contact comes with a French fur trader and explorer named Nicolas Perrot, and begins around 1665. Perrot, in these early stages, is just becoming familiar with Miamia people and other Central Algonquian and Iroquois and Siouan peoples. By the end of his career, he's incredibly experienced. He's multilingual and understands the cultures of all these peoples very thoroughly. But in these early years, he's Pehkitchik, he's a stranger, and to us, and we're strangers to him. And so these earliest recordings represent him struggling to be understood and struggling to work through the building of an alliance with all of these peoples against the Haudenosaunee, against the Iroquois. When Perrot first arrives on these villages south of Green Bay in the 1660s, he finds these refugee communities we're talking about, many large refugee communities, villages stacked one on top of the other along these river valleys. And the village or series of villages that Miamia people are living in have about 4,000 to 5,000 men of arms-bearing age. So this is a high concentration of military men, or what people call warriors, in a village, and perhaps an indicator of at least 20,000 people overall living in these villages. And this is massive. A large village for Myanmar people is a couple of thousand people, and really smaller than 1,000 might have even been more the norm. So 20,000 people living on top of each other is dramatically different. It's a highly unique circumstance in our history. And you can think about all the issues with health and hygiene that come with that many people living on top of each other. And then, of course, the issues of personality conflicts, alliance between slightly different communities, or, if there's Kickapoo or Mascoutin people living there, alliances with different tribal folks. So there's also Ottawa and Potawatomi and Menominee living nearby. So you've got a lot of people who have known each other for generations, but they're not the same communities. And so you can imagine there's lots of friction going on when he's visiting, and that shows up over and over again in his record. We're going to read a couple of passages from Perrault in class and think more in depth about both what we can learn from Perrault, and then what are the challenges there when you read a document like that. What's missing. Where are the potential pitfalls in terms of where Perrault might have misunderstood things, and we'll ask ourselves what we can do with a document like that. What are the limits to it? We'll talk again more about Perrault's recordings in class, but it's even more difficult because Perrault's original journals are actually lost. And what we have are the writings of a historian named Lepathérie, who interviewed Perrault and read his journals and then wrote kind of a history of that. And so you have multiple lenses of interpretation in these documents. You've got Perrault, who's not fully fluent in the languages of the cultures he's visiting, a French-speaking person. You've got then Lepathérie, a French-speaking historian, interpretation of what Perrault wrote and what Perrault said. And then you've got the English-speaking historians who later on translated Lepathérie. So there's so many layers of linguistic and historical translation going on in these documents that we always have to remember when we read them, that all of these layers are there between us and the past. Other documents are less problematic, to be honest, but some of these early French documents are highly problematic and have to be used and employed very, very carefully, and we'll talk about that in class. So Nicolas Perrault is one of the primary individuals responsible for initiating this new alliance between the French and the Algonquian peoples living in these refugee communities in Wisconsin. And access to French trade goods is an important part of this alliance, but also just finding a way, a group who can serve as kind of the mediator among all these different communities to help unify and direct people towards the goal of pushing the Iroquois back to their traditional homelands in what became upstate New York. That's one of the primary roles the French served. It's not just that they provided the metal weapons and the guns, but they provided sort of unifying principles. They were, some people would say, kind of the glue that held all these groups together in this period of time. And the effort is largely successful. By the 1690s, the Haudenosaunee have been pushed back to their traditional homelands, and the Haudenosaunee began to formally request peace. They realized that the tables had been completely turned, and that they better request peace before people started invading even more dramatic fashion their homelands. And so the French set up, together with Perrault's help, as well as other Frenchmen who had been working in the Great Lakes, set up a peace negotiation in Montreal that was to take place in the year 1701. And today this peace is called the Great Peace of Montreal. And it took a long time to set up this peace conference, but in the end thousands of people attended it, and it produced a really interesting shift in behavior and gave birth to a new kind of family in North America, especially in the Great Lakes. And we began this presentation looking at the image from this treaty, And it's useful for us to, again, step back to last week's presentation and think about what it means to be family. Ewe Mangweke, we talked about the relationship between younger siblings and older siblings, elder brothers and younger siblings, and the obligations that existed among those family groups. And this is where our language is really important as an interpretive tool, as a means by which we can understand our present as well as our past. And when we talk about being related, Ewe Mangweke, or if I'm talking to an individual, Ewe Malane, I have you as my relative, there's connotations there in Miamia that aren't fully there in English. So to talk about peace, Awenda One is the noun for peace, or one of the nouns for peace in Miamia Tawenge. Awenda One is built off of the same stem as Ewe Mangweke. So peace and family are kind of an interconnected concept. If you look here at this image, you can see that they're inside the same circle of a peaceful relationship, a family relationship. And if I also wanted to say that I'm thankful, Ewenga Ane, again, that's built off of the same stem, same verb stem, so that all of these things are overlapping. To be family, to be peaceful, to have a peaceful relationship together, to be thankful, are all overlapping concepts. That's what it means to have an alliance or be at peace with each other. And you can see outside of that are the concepts we've talked about last week: pekecheke, strangers, katakiamononake, enemies, kind of the dangerous space of warfare and uncertainty. So the Great Peace of Montreal was an attempt to create a much bigger family, to bring more people into the network. When we would say Ewe Mangweke, who would be included in that. And first and foremost, it was about creating a relationship of family between us and the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, who were here at this treaty and agreed to the principles of it. And most likely, the treaty doesn't make this clear, but based on later documents, it looks like they would take on the role of elder brothers to many of us in this through this process, but certainly family. And then, more dramatically, for the first time in our history, a father figure is added to the family. So, to the best of our knowledge, prior to 1701, this idea of kinship networks included grandfathers, elder brothers, younger siblings, and then for some Algonquian tribes, they talked about a relationship between uncles and nephews. That doesn't show up among Miamia people, but it does show up among Shawnee, for example. But in none of those examples do we see father being used as a part of the family until the French. And so the French, through this treaty, take on the role of father. And it's interesting historical change here. It's really the birth of a new family, but also the birth of new family roles. And it later on leads to conflict, but there's this expectation from our ancestors' perspective that a father cares for his children and provides for them. So provides a warm, dry space to sleep, and provides them with food and the material things necessary for life. This is sort of metaphorically what a father is supposed to do. But a father, a person I would call Nusa in Yamaatawenge, is never a disciplinarian. So they're not the kind of person that enforces the rules or punishes. They provide sort of unconditional love and care. And this was what the expectation of what the French would do after the Treaty of Montreal. And children then owed the father to listen to the father's advice and to allow the father to mediate when conflicts occurred within the family. So there was an acknowledgement that conflicts are going to occur. We've just created this new relationship with the Iroquois. It's not going to be perfect, and there's going to be conflict, perhaps even violence, and that it's the French father who's going to mediate and bring those conflicts to peaceful resolution so that warfare doesn't break out again. And our obligation is to listen to the advice of our father and respect his advice. But it doesn't necessarily mean we have to obey the father. It didn't mean we had to obey the father as sort of a commanding force. That wasn't in the Miamia mind what a father was supposed to do. Now, of course, the French had a whole different belief system around what a father was, both in the actual familial sense and here in the political sense as well. And we'll talk about that in incoming historical presentations. But the Great Peace of Montreal opened the doorway for a fully safe return to the Wabash River Valley, which had already begun by 1690. People began to push back into the valley, but who could more safely occupy the Wabash River Valley after 1700 and reoccupy our old village sites, rebuild our villages, and begin to return to stability. And Miami populations in the years that followed did recover. Again, moving up into the potentially up into the tens, 10, 11,000 people, maybe 12,000 people, as these villages reestablish themselves and populations increase. So the return to the Wabash River Valley following the Great Peace of Montreal represents another moment of emergence, kind of like a re-emergence. After the peace, we returned to our homelands, but many things have changed. Our relationships to peoples that have been a part of our family for a long time are strengthened. We've transformed strangers, Pehkecheke, into Ewemangweke, as we took the French, a people that we called the Mehtekushia, transformed them from strangers into family, as they took on the role of father or Nusa to our community. And then transforming former enemies, Katakiamononake, among the Iroquois, into Ewemangweke, into family as a part of a system of alliance. One thing I hope that's really clear throughout this period, 1640 to 1700, is that change has always been a part of who we are as people. In this particular period of time, a lot of the changes are very negative, a lot of loss and disruption and dislocation. By the end, of course, that's turned around, but that this is a heightened period of change doesn't mean that before it we didn't change, and of course after it we didn't change. This is in direct contrast to the textbooks that oftentimes paint tribal peoples as an unchanging people of the past, kind of frozen in time before the arrival of Europeans and the light of civilization changing us, and all these sad tropes that continue. Simply not true. It's erroneous. We've always changed as a people, always struggling to survive, and in some cases changing in ways that help us thrive in our past. So what we're going to wrestle with in class this upcoming week is the questions that the French sources leave us with. How do they limit us? How do they educate us? And what questions are we left with after reading these sources? What silences or absences are there in the record that maybe can never be filled, but need to be acknowledged, that those voices or those perspectives aren't there? It's only by acknowledging the limitation of sources that we can really fully use them in a way that helps us understand the past. So we're going to constantly ask that question: what do European sources do for us? How do they help us understand our history? And how do we employ these sources carefully? So that's gonna be the main focus of class this week, and maybe you can begin thinking about that after this presentation. So while this period of time kind of ends with the Great Peace of Montreal, the closing of the Beaver Wars, the Fur Trade Wars, and the return of our ancestors to the Wabash River Valley, it doesn't bring an end to this era of contact. We began with looking at the Miamia story of our first contact with the French, and then we looked at the French stories of their contact with us in what became Wisconsin. But contact didn't end there. Miamia people make contact eventually with the Akalashima, with the British, make contact with German-speaking peoples who were within the British Empire, Pennsylvanians, for example, or Virginians, English-speaking peoples within the British Empire who are different culturally from other people who settle on the eastern seaboard, or become different over time. We also make contact with Spanish-speaking peoples, Ixpoala, make contact with the descendants of African slaves who were brought to North America by the British colonists. And so this process of contact is an ongoing one, and it's interesting to read sort of the British sources of their first contact with Mia people, which occur later, and compare and contrast them with the French sources. Some of the same patterns emerge. The other thing for us to think about as we move forward is that the Jesuit sources in the language record, what come out of the Jesuit language materials, the dictionaries that we work with, are unique and different from, for instance, Perot's sources. And a large part of that, it's obvious, is because our language is there, which gives us a different perspective and very obviously and clearly gives voice to our ancestors. Those are actually the sounds our ancestors spoke, written down on that paper to the best of the Jesuits' ability. The Jesuit documents certainly don't remove the French lens. The French lens is there, but in many cases they're writing down direct quotes taken from speakers of Miami, Illinois. And so these documents present us with a really interesting historical window. They're much more difficult to use than Perot's document because it's not a nice, neat narrative. It's not a story that you can follow. And the interpretation is very hard to parse out, to filter out sometimes. But these Jesuit documents, the language records, present us with a very different opportunity to understand the past of our peoples. We've only just really begun to scrape the surface of potential within these documents in terms of understanding the past. So in 10 years, when someone else, or myself, or a team of people come back to rewrite or retell our history, we're going to know a lot more about this period because of these documents. And we'll be able to understand Perot and Grossier in very different ways because of the Jesuit language materials. So there's always more to know, always more to learn, and it's exciting to think about how our understanding of the past might grow and change very radically in the near future. So until next week, in our next history presentations, Neolaka Kokakate, Shaya.